this explainer and decode what is arguably one of the most notoriously dense texts in economic history, the first chapter of Karl Marx's Capital. Historically, this book has been viewed as this massive, impenetrable wall of theory. But today, we're putting on our investigator hats. We're going to completely bypass the sweeping political statements and meticulously trace the source text step-by-step logic. We're zooming all the way in on the absolute fundamental building block of society to understand how the very concept of value is constructed from the ground up.
So, Marx's arguments are literally step-by-step. To strictly follow his logic, we'll start with the cell of wealth, then contrast use value and exchange value. From there, we uncover the hidden substance of value, measure it with socially necessary labor time, break down the twofold nature of labor, and finally, look at how value physically expresses itself.
Section 1. The Cell of Wealth.
So, where do we start? We begin exactly where the text begins. To solve the mystery of economic value, we have to ask ourselves what actually gives a simple, everyday object its worth on the market. Think about it. If you pick up a chunk of iron, a roll of linen, or even just a winter coat, what makes us so sure one is worth more than the other? How do we even measure that invisible weight?
The text tackles this by pointing out that we can't just look at the entire economy all at once. It's way too chaotic. Marx argues that just as a biologist uses a microscope to study a single cell to understand the whole human body, economists have to use what he calls the force of abstraction to study the single commodity. In a capitalist society, wealth presents itself as this immense, overwhelming accumulation of commodities. The logic here is pretty straightforward. If we can just decode the DNA of one single commodity, we essentially unlock the blueprint of the entire economic system.
Moving on to Section 2, Use Value versus Exchange Value.
By stripping away its physical properties, the text argues that every everyday object actually has a split identity. It's a dual nature. First up is use value. This is purely physical. It's the literal utility of the object. A coat keeps you warm, right? A bowl of corn feeds you. It completely satisfies a human want and is strictly qualitative. You can't wear an exchange rate, but on the flip side, we have exchange value. This has absolutely nothing to do with keeping you warm. Exchange value is just the quantitative trading ratio, that constantly shifting proportion where one use value is traded for a totally different use value.
That takes us to Section 3, the hidden substance of value.
Now, this creates a massive logical contradiction that the text really forces us to confront. Using an example straight from the book, think about corn and iron. If a specific amount of corn perfectly equals a specific amount of iron on the market, how is that even possible? I mean, corn and iron share zero physical, chemical, or geometrical properties that actually matter here. You eat corn, you build with iron. Because they're completely different in their physical use, there simply has to be a hidden, third substance common to both of them that lets them balance out on a scale.
So what happens if you completely remove that physical use value? If you strip away the fact that one is food and one is metal, what's the one single common property left? The text concludes that the only thing remaining is that they are both products of human labor. But, and this is absolutely key, not the specific labor of the farmer or the miner. No, once you strip away the physical form, you strip away the specific type of labor too. What you're left with is pure, undifferentiated, abstract human labor. Both the corn and the iron are basically just frozen, crystallized blocks of general human energy. And that right there is the hidden substance of value.
Okay, Section 4, Socially Necessary Labor Time.
We've established that labor creates value, right? But this instantly brings up a pretty funny question that the text actually anticipates. Think about it. If labor creates value, does a really slow, clumsy worker magically create a more valuable product just because it takes them way longer to make it? The answer is an absolute no. Value is not measured by an individual stopwatch. It's measured strictly by socially necessary labor time. This means value is determined by the average time required by society under normal conditions, using average skill and typical technology. The market doesn't care if you're unskillful, it only cares about the social average. What's really fascinating here is how technology violently disrupts this average. Marx outlines factors that change how productive labor is, things like science, technology, and nature. He gives this historical example of when power looms were introduced in England. Literally overnight, this new technology cut the socially necessary labor time to weave yarn into cloth completely in half. The traditional hand loom weavers were still working just as hard, sweating for the exact same amount of hours, but suddenly, the value of their cloth plummeted by 50%. The social average had completely moved on, leaving the individual behind.
This brilliantly illustrates a core dynamic. Value varies directly with the quantity of labor and inversely with the productivity of that labor. Let's look at diamonds. They are incredibly valuable because they're super rare and take an immense amount of labor time to find and dig up. But the text proposes a really interesting thought experiment. What if we suddenly developed a technology that could cheaply and easily convert carbon into diamonds with almost zero labor? Their value would absolutely crash. They might even become cheaper than ordinary bricks. It's a wild thought, but it perfectly hits the nail on the head.
Moving right along to Section 5, the twofold nature of labor.
Since the commodity has a split personality, use value and exchange value, the author argues it's completely logical that the labor creating it must be split too. He actually calls this the pivot on which the whole comprehension of political economy turns. On one side, we have concrete labor. This is the specific, useful activity. It's the tailor cutting cloth or the weaver working the loom. Concrete labor creates the actual physical use value, the coat itself. But on the other side, we have abstract labor. This totally ignores the tailoring or weaving. It's simply the pure expenditure of human brains, nerves, and muscles. So while concrete labor creates the physical object, it's the abstract labor that forms the invisible substance of market value.
And finally, Section 6, how value is expressed. We've been digging really deep into these invisible, abstract concepts. But this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle in this explainer. How does this abstract, invisible value manage to manifest in the real world so we can actually, see it? Here's the fundamental problem. Value doesn't have physical weight. You can't just put value under a microscope. It doesn't have chemical properties. So how on earth does a commodity tell the world what it's worth? The text argues that commodities literally have to speak to each other. They have to use the physical body of another object to express their own invisible worth.
Marx maps this out using a very basic equation. 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat. Now, the linen cannot express its value all by itself. It can't just jump up and shout, hey, I am worth a certain amount of human labor. Instead, the linen uses the physical body of a completely different commodity, in this case, the coat, as a mirror. By equating itself to the coat, the linen is basically saying, my invisible value looks exactly like the physical body of this coat.
To codify this whole interaction, the text defines two distinct roles. First is the relative form. This is the active commodity, our linen. It's the one actively trying to figure out its worth. Second is the equivalent form. This is the passive commodity, the coat. Now, the coat isn't expressing its own value here at all. It's merely serving as the blank canvas, the actual physical material, for the linen to project its value onto. In this relationship, the invisible, abstract value of the linen finally takes on a physical, recognizable shape by essentially wearing the body of the coat. And that incredible deduction brings us right to the end of Chapter 1's foundational building blocks. But we are left with a massive, lingering question. How does this simple, accidental trade between a pile of linen and a single coat actually scale up? I mean, how does this basic mechanism, where one commodity acts as a physical mirror for another, eventually evolve to create the massive universal system of cash that sits in your wallet today? Well, that is the explosive question that propels the rest of the text, and it's definitely something to think deeply about the very next time you're staring at a price tag.